Welcome back to Cheddar's News Wrap. Climate is perhaps the top priority for world leaders as they gather this week for the 76th session of the UN General Assembly. We've heard in the days leading up to the assembly that this is a pivotal week for climate, especially as countries are set for a climate summit in Scotland later this year. Joining us now for more on this is Dr. Deborah Brosnan, climate expert and president of Deborah Brosnan and Associates. Deborah, welcome to the show. Great to have you. News reports just this week, and of course, like I mentioned in the lead up to the assembly, said this was a pivotal week when it comes to climate. Can you give us a sense as to why this is being treated as quote unquote so pivotal?
I think for several reasons this week in particular. First of all, everybody around the world is feeling the impacts of climate change in ways they've never felt it before. Just recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, came out with a report that basically said we are very unlikely, unless we take major action, very unlikely to keep temperature rises below 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. That is shocking news, and yet I think none of us were surprised. We're aware that our carbon dioxide levels are going up and going up rapidly. So I think that's shocking news that nature immediately supported by having some of the strongest wildfires in California and throughout the West. We had major heat waves in the Pacific Northwest that melted power lines and shut down trams. And we had Hurricane Ida that didn't just affect the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, but it also had major impacts here in the Northeast, in New York, and that stunned a lot of people. So we're having these huge effects around the world. It's not just in the US. These events are happening. The world is suddenly taking more notice of them, and we're now at a critical point. Either we stop making empty pledges or we literally start taking action, the action we need to take right now. And this is the week that those decisions need to be made.
You talked about those empty pledges. We know one of the biggest divides is between wealthy countries and poor countries. We know more developed countries made a pledge years ago to invest $100 billion by 2020 in helping other nations, poorer nations, combat climate change. They've fallen quite short of that goal, Deborah, as you well know. Can you give us a sense of the consequences of not ensuring that these nations have the funding they need to combat climate change?
Yes, first of all, I think a lot of people don't fully realize that these pledges are not met, that they are pledges and the funds have not been delivered. The consequences are huge. So there are 150 developing nations around the world representing 6.5 billion people. That is an awful lot of this world's population, a lot of our communities. The consequences are that these countries do not have the resources to be able to adapt to climate change, whether that is shifting to renewable energies, creating alternative sources of revenue, say beyond tourism, or restoring ecosystems to act as a line of defense against storm surge and rising sea levels, or taking advantage of the blue economy. Basically, what we're doing by not delivering on these pledges is putting these countries at more risk, and we will create more suffering, more droughts, more famine, more hunger, and probably more conflict. The consequences are enormous.
What would it mean for progression when it comes to climate change if we see little to no progress this week at the General Assembly?
I think it will be devastating for people, particularly in these developing countries. I think people will start to think that is it business as usual? Have we not gotten the message yet that our world is changing and we need to take action? I think that some of these as I said, developing countries will feel that they are being hung out to dry. And perhaps we'll start to see people stepping up more as individuals and even more companies stepping up as climate begins to bite. But we are at the cusp of having to take action.
It's safe to say there's a very grim picture when it comes to climate change, not only with the Assembly session this week, but the news we've been getting in the past few months, really the last few years. But is there anything that has made you optimistic as we fight climate change?
Yes, actually plenty. I know the news is grim and the consequences are grim, but at the same time, it's almost like this news has galvanized people on an individual level and also the companies. And in the same way that we're seeing these terrible consequences, what we are seeing, for instance, is I think there's been about 500 billion invested in renewable energy and in electric vehicles. So it's almost like we're starting to see a new, I don't want to call it industrial revolution, but a green revolution in innovation, in technology. And that's starting to spread around the globe. And that gives me a lot of hope. And the other thing that gives me hope is particularly watching the upcoming generation. They are very interested in sustainability. They're very interested in solutions, and they're out there trying to make it work. So I think we have a huge amount of reason to be optimistic.
The next major climate summit is set for later this year in Scotland. What are you hoping to come out of that, Deborah?
Oh, what I'd like to see come out of it is, first of all, a blueprint for action. I think many people have gone to COPs, this is COP26, and we've heard pledges at all of them. And some of those pledges, most of those pledges do not translate into action. We need two things. We need a blueprint for action, and then we need accountability. That's my hope.
Do you think more countries are being transparent when it comes to this and their fight against climate change?
I think they are being more transparent because it's obvious. We're watching it. We see it on TV. We can monitor the weather. We've got satellites. I think countries are being more transparent because they're being forced into it. They're being forced into it by people watching, and they're being forced into it by the actual consequences.
What would you say to the leaders in our country and just leaders at the General Assembly who still may not fully believe in climate change?
Oh, I'd say wake up. Your citizens believe in climate change because they're experiencing climate change. There is not a country in the world that is not feeling the impacts of climate change. I think stop making climate change a political issue. It's not a political issue. It is a humanitarian issue. And start taking action.
Are you surprised to see the progression go downwards as quickly as we have in the last few years, or was this something that was just bound to happen eventually?
When you say the progression, you mean what's happening in our world with?
Yes, I should say the downward progression. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes and no. I think that people really didn't believe that they would be impacted directly by climate change, so that the urgency to take action was not felt. It didn't reach critical mass. It wasn't felt across the globe. So while I'm disappointed, it doesn't really surprise me. What I'm seeing now is an uptick, that there is a surge in response, and that gives me a lot of optimism.
That gives me a lot of optimism as well, Deborah. Deborah Brosnan, climate expert and president of Deborah Brosnan and Associates. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much.